I'm from the Centre for Sustainability Transitions. We had a name change. We used to be the Centre for Complex Systems and Transitions, but the acronym remains the same at Stellenbosch University. And I'll be speaking about a project that, it seems like we're still very much in the project and probably will be in this work for a very long time. But it's work that happened also linked to some of the impacts of COVID. So I think this is one of the examples of opportunities that do come from crises sometimes. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I think the science is really, really clear that there's an urgent need for transformational change. And this is across the board in different systems in different places, especially in South Africa. I think it's an award that is extremely shameful, that we're one of the most unequal countries in the world. And if we think about this within the context of biodiversity and cities, we see these obscene inequalities playing out in city landscapes. So looking at more resource communities having access to green spaces in their homes or being able to walk from their homes to green spaces in comparison to the realities of how many South Africans live. And these patterns, these pictures are all from Cape Town, but I think these patterns play out across South Africa and also in lots of other countries in the global south. And there's often this false dichotomy that you have to choose between the environment or development, that we have to, in order to develop, it means that we have to start carving out landscapes. And so we really need to strive to think about ways to conserve important biodiversity, and especially with growing cities. I think by 2030, there'll be an increase in urban adjacent protected areas. And if we think about the rapid growth in many urban cities, maybe not just the big mega cities, whose responsibility is it then to protect these spaces? And especially in Cape Town, which has extremely unique and high kind of biodiversity values, how do we move forward in terms of thinking about and rethinking city planning processes? And also moving from notions of protection, which are based on kind of legacies of exclusion, from protection to connection. So how do we rethink these multifunctional land and seascapes within an urban context? There's also massive inequalities in urban green space provision. So access to green spaces are extremely intersectional. If we think about how city, especially with the legacies of apartheid, how cityscapes have been planned, these cut across kind of race, gender, education, class. This is just a map of some research that's been done around access to urban spaces. And you can see just in terms of the work that's been done looking at how people access urban spaces in cities, a huge gap in Africa, with some work being done in South Africa, but definitely something that we can start thinking about. Often if biodiversity actions are implemented, they maybe think about one ecosystem service and maybe not thinking about these connected multifunctional landscapes. And if we start thinking about the urgent crisis of both biodiversity loss and climate change, that they're closely interconnected and share common drivers through human activities. And so resolving one of these issues requires consideration of both. Lots of work that's been done around kind of governance of these systems, and especially we see it playing out in Cape Town with the exclusion of indigenous and local knowledge in city planning processes with the Amazon development and the Liesbeek River. So how do we start rethinking all of these processes, and especially if we're wanting people to connect to nature, and if nature isn't part of their everyday lives, how do we start building those connections? So some work that's been done in cities with biodiversity, thinking about the value of nature in urban life, and really trying to use kind of more creative processes around mapping the key benefits from nature in cities, and connecting both the value and the threat. So what happens if we start losing some of these important natural assets? And especially if these are done in participatory ways where people can start seeing, being in those places, understanding where the values are, really generating a greater sense of place in some of these landscapes. So this requires kind of a new narratives for urban human nature futures. If we're thinking about what are these cities going to look like, we have all sorts of information flying at us from sci-fi novels to movies, and often we presented with two options. So it's either the kind of a very utopian future with slick public transport, amazing infrastructure, nature planned in the cities, people, really happy and being able to manage these processes in good ways, or we presented with this very dystopic future. So it's kind of collapse, extinction, crises, and not too many conversations about, well, what are the different options, and how can we articulate these options, especially in ways that resonate with the realities of African cities and African urban spaces, and also that multiple futures exist. So these conversations are really important, and running processes that start to surface some of these different visions of what the future may look like, especially with the people that are going to inherit the future, are really, really useful. And these are conversations that are starting to happen, and lots of people are using kind of futuring and foresight processes to try and surface these different visions of what the future may look like, especially considering the new global biodiversity framework that is being currently negotiated and released soon. So when we're thinking about the future, it's often this thing that happens out there, but actually if we're looking for these seeds of potential change, they're happening all around us. And I'm sure for the rest, these next couple of days, we're going to hear some of the seeds that are already happening. These are just some examples of these potential seeds for transformation in the present. There's the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes, which is collecting a whole lot of seeds and has a database. ICLE are running a whole lot of projects in cities with the Cities with Nature initiative. There's also some conceptual work that's being done around convivial conservation and what does it mean to move from protection to connection in rethinking multifunctional landscapes. But what I'm going to spend the rest of my talk, and hopefully I don't run out of time, is talking about two projects, or they're connected to two kind of initiatives. The one is the massive movements of youth in biodiversity conversations, climate change conversations, and these incredible youth networks that are happening all over Africa, all over the world. But closer to home, where I live in Muizenberg in Cape Town, a local NGO, Amavo Oluntu, and the Nkunku Sandberg Restoration Project have started this project called Pollinating Pride in People. And it really is a way to connect, especially young people, with the nature that exists around them, and using fynbos to inspire kind of entrepreneurship. So it's a dual process of using nature to kind of inform how they may think about generating wealth and generating well-being in the landscapes that they live in, and importantly, providing access to those spaces as well. So within all these conversations and thinking about kind of the future and what it may look like, what is the role of youth in and for transformative change? And especially within the context that many of us work in, how do we communicate biodiversity loss, but also hope in ways that resonates with the aspirations of young people? And I think there's often this thing that the youth are just waiting to inherit the world, but they're actually, already actively shaping our emerging futures, and I have taken to the streets and taken countries to court, and so there's a lot to learn from those movements, and especially from the ones that are happening around us, and thinking of ways to support them. So I think, what I've been involved in recently is thinking about ways to include youth in decisions about urban futures, or just futures in general, especially the ones they're set to inherit. And this is, I think there's a movement that's happening now. The youth used to be invited into processes, and they could maybe be like a little stakeholder that sits on the side, but now there are lots of places where the youth are actually taking over those processes and saying, well, actually we don't just want a seat at the table, we want a whole different table to have these conversations. So how do we start supporting those type of movements, and especially people doing research? How can we provide information in ways that are useful to some of these movements? So this is the one project that we got involved in. I've been involved in the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services for many years in their assessments. And through this work, the Norwegian Environment Agency came and said, we've got some money left over in our budget. Could you run a process with youth in South Africa to see what they think about biodiversity? And so, of course, we said yes to the money. And then we thought, well, what other types of conversations do we want to have? And when we started looking around, we realized that, youth voices are often not taken into account in these futuring processes. So how can we run some processes that start working with young people, and especially youth organizations, because their visions are not articulated in most of the scenarios that you see mapped out for biodiversity, for addressing climate change, for development in general. So we ran a process that we called Youth Nature Futures for Southern Africa. We broadened it beyond South Africa. And in the end, there were 18 youth-led environmental movements across Southern Africa. This was all done peak COVID, so it all had to be online, which wasn't great, but it was really interesting to see how much you actually can do. So lots of conversations, running processes, bringing some of the assessment reports, presenting some of the results, hearing about how they resonated with the work that these organizations were doing. Running some futuring exercises, so we ran a couple of 3 Horizons processes, trying to still bring creativity into the process. So we had a live graphic harvester, we had a poet who also harvested words and created a poem, and really just a way for them to also connect with each other. So there's a website that I can share with you. We generated a video. One of the outputs was an art competition. We just said, if we give you money, what will you do in order to communicate the work that you do in your communities? And they did incredible things, from poems to murals to dances to songs to food, new recipe collections. And so that's all captured there on the website and is really, really exciting. The graphic harvester created those images in black and white, just listening to the conversations. And this was really inspiring, I think, because we started thinking about different ways that we can articulate the science that we do and have conversations in very, very different ways. So the work that I'll speak about for the rest of the day was built on that. We also, through working with the artists that were involved, also through the top kind of right-hand corner, during COVID, as many of us, I think, realized there were lots of communities that needed support, so started building food solidarity networks across the greater Muizenberg area where I live, with adjacent neighborhoods of Capricorn and Vrygrond. So setting up these food emerging community kitchens to try and provide support during the lockdowns, and met some incredible young people. So a lot of the work that was happening was done by young people that were just like, well, we need to do something, we've got energy, and so started having conversations with them. And through those conversations, kind of chopping vegetables, making stews, started talking about things that obviously, we care about. And for me, it was about the environment and having conversations around that. We also, the City of Cape Town wanted to know how they can communicate climate change information in more accessible ways. And so through the university, there was a very, very small grant that came out through the Cape Higher Education Consortium, which just said, we want to know ways to build resilience. And we said, okay, well, maybe we could do that. And so a few of us got together. It was mostly people in kind of our neighborhood, and put in a small grant, which we got. Also, it was working with people, so artists, people from these community kitchens, from local NGOs. There's also the Beach Co-op that runs a plastic cleanup every month. They've been doing it for about 10 years, and they've got amazing data on how plastic, what types of plastic are being found in spaces. And so this was our objective, which we sent and got funding for. And then we thought, okay, so now how are we going to do this? It was a really interesting process of really co-developing the project from the beginning with everybody. I think with artists and the artist collective that we worked with, which are the Hand Control 360. They're responsible for a lot of the public art murals that you'll see in Cape Town. Creatives are often brought at the end of a project. They are asked to communicate our work once we've done all of the science, and now can you make it look pretty? And so this was a process of, well, how can we actually use creative methods to run the process? And so they were front and center of most of the conversations that we had. There were researchers from Stellenbosch University. You may see Odie, a familiar face for some. Also from UCT, Fiona Atkins, who works at UCT, but also for the Beach Co-op. There were members from the City of Cape Town that were involved in the project, from their Resilience and Coastal Management Group. Amava Oluntu, a local NGO that works with youth in Muizenberg. And so we really also thought it was important to kind of walk the landscapes. And so what did we want this project to achieve? And it really was around connection. It was around understanding systems. So how do we build a systems understanding using a very tangible thing? So plastic is quite useful. You can see it, you can pick it up, you can hold it in your hand, and it also moves through systems, through water, through wind, through people picking it up and throwing it away, through recycling schemes that then end up back in river systems. And so I started planning this engagement process. We wanted it to be as creative as possible, and so we created a workbook. I don't have one here, but it was a little workbook that had a whole lot of prompts for reflections. And this is also how we wanted to collect some of the data. So not asking questions or interviewing people, but really saying, going through these processes. We ran a series of workshops. How does it make you feel? What did you think? Some information synthesized around some of the kind of topics that we wanted to cover around plastic pollution, climate change. What is the function of a flay? So we worked in Sunflay to also try and understand some of the ecology in the local spaces. And yeah, just a whole lot of different work pages that they would work throughout the series of workshops. And I think this was really useful because often it's an information overload and everything gets dumped at the beginning, and then maybe there's a different type of process. And so we tried and failed in some instances. I think people were quite hesitant to put the first mark on a page, but really these were their workbooks and they could write whatever they wanted or draw or doodle, and they were encouraged to do so. And this is the beauty of working with artists, I think, is they can make conversations come alive that I certainly could never do. So the first workshop was in Muizenberg. It was trying to understand some of the connections in that seascape, so a coastal system that's connected with a flay, and importantly having conversations around plastic and how plastic is linked to kind of consumption and production, how it's linked to the fossil fuel industry, how we can actually start making very small changes ourselves just by looking at the environment around us. And so we walked from kind of Muizenberg up the flay, had multiple conversations, stopped and learnt about kind of estuarine ecology, and continued to walk past a couple of murals. So the whole process was designed to have multiple conversations during the walk. So stopping at these murals, that's actually when things came alive. So the scientists that were involved in it were really excited about the first part, and people were kind of like, okay, this is exciting. But actually, the conversations that happened underneath this heron were probably the most exciting. And it really showed the role of public art, or art just in general, for democratizing science. So the language that's used in science is often very, it excludes people, it's not accessible. And I think also including youth facilitators. So we had 2 youth facilitators from Amavo Luntu who had been involved in another project around climate change, led the process. And that completely shifted things and shifted conversations. And they shared their journey of in the beginning when they started working on the topic. Climate change wasn't a thing that happened to them, it happened out there. And yeah. So we also ended every process with sharing a meal and conversations around the food we eat, where it comes from, how it's produced, the labor that's involved in the whole food system. And luckily, we had the Muizenberg kitchen in Muizenberg, which was also set up during COVID. And that was just a really lovely way to kind of end off things. The second workshop we had in Mitchell's Plain. And so that was working with green open spaces. This is a stormwater retention pond. And the perceptions of these ponds are, this is just open space that could be housing. What is it for? Why is it here? Why can't we use it in different ways? So having conversations around that. It was also where some of the artists were from, so they had a deep connection to Mitchell's Plain. We were very lucky to have Chief Kingsley, who came and led a process. With every workshop that we had, we acknowledged the spaces that we were in, and especially the ancestors and people that lived and worked and enjoyed and were custodians of those spaces. It was quite, the city has not mowed this area, so all sorts of biodiversity came back. We only realized just how many frogs there were when we were kind of singing a song, and when we stopped, suddenly all the frogs started, so that was quite an incredible moment. Again, starting with kind of a blessing, cleaning the space, so cleaning as an act of work and gratefulness to the spaces where we're in. And this was to also understand how systems are connected. So it seems like this is quite far from Muizenberg, but actually these systems are connected. And thinking about plastic and how it moves through these systems, what you do in one space is connected to other spaces as well. Lots of conversations around the role of open spaces. We worked with UCT, the Water Futures Institute, and they're running a process here understanding all of the city's retention and detention ponds and their role in mitigating and mediating kind of water security and also mediating floods. So again, working with the workbooks, thinking about ways to reimagine spaces. So if they were to plan these spaces in a different way, what could they look like? And those are really hard conversations to imagine if you ask that question and if your reality has always been one thing. So again, using kind of immersive practices. So this is a weaving process that has been developed, a hydro rug where you collect plastic and weave it and have conversations at the same time by Anya, who's from the Beach Co-op and also doing her PhD on these types of processes. And I have to speed now. We also were lucky, Tara, a French research vessel, came and docked in the V&A waterfront. We joined them. Participants could go on board, identify plankton, phytoplankton through microscopes, and they asked us to do a mural. So the image I showed at the beginning was we had a whole lot of boards, and everyone could be involved in painting the mural, including kids and just visitors. And we also visited a potential site for our end mural. So the process was leading to the development of a mural that would be painted by all participants in a public space. So the last workshop also built on that, trying to solidify our ideas, have conversations, do collaging, and actually start painting some of the practice boards. And those are some of the images from that. So the next steps are around, we've got permission from the city to paint the mural. The Ratepayers Association in Mully Point has said no. And unfortunately, the way that permitting happens, so even though there are so many people that want this mural to happen and it'll be such a public asset and conversation starter around important issues, there's a small selection of people that can stop this process. So getting involved in the messy politics of urban planning processes. And also another workshop at Food Jams to kind of do some more creative featuring. So these are some of the learnings that we had through the process, and we're still in the process. And it's all through kind of emerging these co-learning, but some of it's around unlearning things, relearning things, continuous learning. There's a deep need. A lot of the information on climate change is completely inaccessible to a lot of people, especially young people, and especially in kind of urban contexts. There's also the role of challenging deficit discourses. We go into spaces saying that you have nothing and we need to build your capacity, but actually, we realize that these capacities exist in so many amazing ways in these different communities. The youth are ready, they're there, they want to get involved, they just need support and resources, and they want to have conversations with people. They just need information that is accessible. Futuring is a really useful process, but it's quite hard. Also, whatever futures we make, we're starting making them right now. And so it's important to decolonize those futures, because whatever decisions we make now, we carry into the future as well. So what conversations can we have around that? There's also, this is probably one of the biggest take-home messages, doing nothing is still work. So we go into these spaces and we want to run a workshop and we quickly facilitate these processes, but actually some of the most amazing insights came from doing nothing and from people recognizing that they were allowed to be in these spaces. These are public spaces, anyone can be there, and a lot of the participants didn't know that, didn't feel welcome. And so just allowing space to do nothing, to have conversations was incredibly important. And for kind of researchers as well that want to run a process and get information, and you had an agenda and you worked so hard on things. So that was a big learning for the project team. Using public spaces, using community spaces, using outdoor classrooms was also really, really important, because also it gives people confidence to then go back into those spaces as well once they've been used. I think there wasn't a single process that we ran when trauma didn't surface. So every conversation, it was either something that happened on the way to the event, something that had happened that weekend, to them, to friends, to family, and we are wildly ill-equipped to deal with this. So how can we bring kind of trauma-informed research practices into the processes that we lead? Because even if you think it's not surfacing, it's there. It's often the elephant in the room. And just building on all the work that is happening. I think often we compete with each other for funding and for processes, but actually trying to find ways to do some network weaving is really, really important. And also making sure that the conversations we have are diverse, they're intersectional, they're inclusive, they're facilitated, by different people at different stages with different skills and capacities. And another important learning was around art. So I think art is a language, it's a language that everyone has within them. and it completely changes the ballgame when you start bringing art and arts-based practices into processes. There's no longer, the scientists that know everything and no one else knows anything. Everybody is wildly, unless, you are an artist, out of their comfort zone, but are able to articulate things in incredible ways. And especially important for catalyzing new imaginaries of what the futures could look like. And then just mindful of exploiting passions. I think this project had a tiny budget. I think at the end it was around 80,000 Rand. And everyone turned up and showed up because they were passionate about it. But it does, there's also privilege attached to that for people that have their salaries covered, and for participants that, one participant said, I have to choose between putting food on the table or doing art, and I need both to live. So how do we support people to be able to be engaged in those processes?